Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and I got a couple bins I'm planning to feed today. Over on the bench I've already got the food laid out for them, and the bins that I'm talking about are over there. Last time we checked in on them 12 days ago, they were still occupying the position that these two tubs up here are occupying. But since that time, I've now got two newer systems. Last time we checked in on them 12 days ago, they were my newest systems. They're right down here, and they have red wiggler worms in them. So when we last fed them 12 days ago, we still saw very little progress on the novelty item that was placed into these bins. 33 days ago we put a piece of beach towel into each system. Last time we fed, I put a banana peel on top of each of those, kind of making me wonder if perhaps by doing so maybe we'll see a little bit more progress on them. As of last time we checked in, I still didn't see any progress, but after only 33 days, it might still be too soon to see anything. So we're going to get these systems up on the bench, take care of getting them fed. So let's get to work. So now, as usual, I've got the older system out here on the bench to feed that one first. We'll get to the younger one next. Before we get started, and I soil my glove, I've got my little information board with a little bit of extra stuff about these bins shown here. Stuff we haven't talked about yet. I mean, we already talked about how the last feeding was 12 days ago and how the cotton fabric added to these systems has been in there for 33 days now. In the case of this older bin, it's been fed 7 times, so this will be feeding number 8. In the case of the younger one, it'll be feeding number 5. And the ages of these systems are 86 for this one and 51 days for the other one. So with that taken care of, why don't we get to it? Now, from what I remember, one of the systems was given a replacement top covering piece of newspaper, and the other one, its top covering newspaper had been in service for some time already, making me wonder if it might already be at that point of degradation that it might require a replacement. I mean, this one's looking pretty good, so this one might actually be the one that was replaced and probably doesn't need another one in its place. So I think we'll stick with this top covering newspaper. I've got a replacement top covering newspaper on standby should we decide to replace what's in one of them, but here I don't think we need to. And even though this feeding zone indicator is doing great in terms of holding up, but I think we're just going to go ahead and recycle it, because part of what they're being fed today includes coffee, which includes a couple new coffee filters. So I think this will just become bedding, and I'm going to also try to use up a couple of these soiled napkins that I've got laying around here. They're starting to pile up, so I'd really like to do away with this stuff. So that's going to be some of the bedding we're going to include down in the feeding zone. So the feeding zone indicator showed us how we fed down the middle last time. So I'm curious to see how things are coming along in here. The moisture level seems quite adequate. And let's see, I do remember us adding some, a variety of different layers of bedding. So we put some crinkled paper down, then we put a little bit of the fresh food that they were getting. And then we laid down some other bedding, maybe some of my prepared bedding, on top of which we placed in some of the older objects that we found that were still showing up as leftover food items from previous feeding. And then we put in some leaves, and then the banana peel. And then on top of the leaves came the beach towel, and onto the beach towel came the banana peel. So we did stack the bedding and the food items up as we fed last time. So here's pieces of the banana peel they got last time. It feels very thin, like paper thin almost, which tells me they've been nibbling off all of the banana that was still stuck to the peel, but they've just not managed to work their way through the entire peel quite yet. That's actually pretty good progress for 12 days if you ask me. That this first object that we encountered here is just a little fragment of corn cob. So small, I would say the diameter of it is perhaps, I don't know if you're familiar with American currency, perhaps the diameter of a nickel or maybe even a dime. Maybe somewhere in the middle, maybe a penny. And let's see, is this just another chunk of banana peel? I think other than the banana peel, some of the stuff that was fed to these guys last time was stuff that might not be expected to be seen as leftovers. I think there might have been some potato peel. I forget, I just really breezed through the video from our last check-in in here 12 days ago to see how things looked and just to refresh my memory a bit, but I didn't actually play it all back and watch it from start to finish. So now let's just see how this piece of cotton fabric is doing. This piece of towel. The same exact towel from which this piece was cut was already used once in the past. So I did already compost some of this towel long ago, and I do remember sitting around, you know, gradually getting to the point where the worms can finally dig into it. However, I don't think we've kind of, you know, reached that point yet. We're still kind of getting there. So let's see, we've got some leftovers of avocado down here. So that must be some of the remains of previous feedings that we placed in here, and I can even sense the smell of some, I think it's probably lime or it could be lemon, some sort of a citrusy odor. Kind of giving me that nice little fresh smell. And what do we have here? The avocado's pit. I don't know, I'm always kind of compelled to see if I can give it just a little squeeze to see if it'll crack, and I can feel my thumb actually creating a little divot in the side of it. And oh, what have we here? The cork that goes back way back. Not only days or weeks or months, I would say years at this point. So what else do we have? I think there's other large objects down in here that I'm bumping into. This is the seed out of a mango. Again, something that I just can't seem to resist wanting to test to a certain degree to see how it's coming along, to see if I can at least maybe give it a squeeze and separate the two halves to reveal the seed inside. But I don't want to go too overboard trying, because I give it too hard of a squeeze and then the thing goes slipping between my fingers, goes flying across the room. I get castings in my hair. And we're also seeing some leftover bits of cantaloupe rind, so some of these leftovers I would assume go back many feedings at this point. And there's worms throughout this material, but since there is a lot of fresh leafy bedding in here, it's almost as if they've got a nice camouflage environment to hide in. So I can't really spot them all, but I'm sure there's a lot of them in here. It does look to me like we've got a pretty good number of them in here. The numbers are a little bit skewed in terms of these two buddy bins. Like one of them, I believe, has only about 900 worms in it, while the other one has close to 1,700 worms in it. To tell you the truth, I didn't write that down on my information board, so I don't even remember which was which. So this is the stem of a pumpkin, gradually getting broken down too. That's also an object that goes way back. I believe that object actually came in with the worms from their previous environment, as did the cork. So some of those long-term items just traveled with the worms from their old into their current environment. But we've now excavated a pretty decent sized hole, and I've attempted to check out most of the objects we've encountered along the way. This is the stem of a banana. I'm sure I missed a good bit of stuff too here, some peel of avocado. But I think it's time to get them fed. So we're going to plop in, I guess, these napkins. We'll begin by making these as sort of the foundation for our feeding today. And I've been a little bit stingy with my prepared bedding lately. I'm pretty sure I'm running kind of low on leaves down here, so I don't think I have enough to use those as bedding in here today, but I know I've got a freshly replenished batch of my prepared bedding. I was kind of hoarding what I have because my shredder had pooped out and I had to throw it away because it was completely shot. But I've since replaced it, with not only one, but actually with two shredders. So now not only do I have a replacement shredder, but I've even got a backup, which is kind of nice. So I can shred to my heart's content. So let's see. Last time we, layered in the old and new foods, I'm not sure we need to go to that extent, but we can follow a somewhat similar routine. So perhaps before we place in some of what we bought for them here as fresh, we can lay in some of the old stuff. But I'd like to be a little bit more strategic in terms of giving this piece of towel a good fair shot at getting broken down. So I thought that perhaps by putting a banana peel on top of it last time it might get a good bit of attention, but today I thought that perhaps we can actually nest it right in between the old and the freshly added new foods, which would almost guarantee that worms are going to be hitting this thing from above and below. And now we can start piling in, I believe, some of this yummy stuff they've got. There's Brussels sprout leaves in here, there's carrot peels, there's potato peels, there's even a little bit of orange rind. So there's a nice assortment of stuff in here. I believe if we grab another handful, we will have divvied out the food supply evenly to give each system pretty much an equal amount. And I think, even though one system I know has more than the other, offhand I can't remember if it was this system or the other system. So I figured, you know what? Let's just divvy out the food evenly. And perhaps next time I'll come prepared with the knowledge of which system has the greater number of worms living in it. And then maybe I can, divvy out the food accordingly based on where the perceived need is. So now, like I said, I've replenished my supply of prepared bedding, but before I reach in there with my glove, I do want to make sure I'm not implanting any worms into it. So I don't have any worms on my glove. So I can come in here with my, oh my goodness, it's got some good weight to it because it is full and it is prepared with moisture, with water. So it's got a good bit of moisture content to it, so it's somewhat heavy. And it's actually the last of my old supply of shredded paper and cardboard from my old shredder. So before we lay in the coffee, I thought that we would give that coffee and worm chow a nice foundation of bedding materials into which they can drop in, and then not only are we going to attract worms to this with the yummy coffee being placed on top of the towel, it's also going to be a whole bunch of this nice prepared bedding. So let's get into trying to get this in here without making a huge mess. This we'll just set aside because it'll become our replacement feeding zone indicator. This coffee filter. And on top of the coffee, something I've been doing lately is sprinkling in the worm chow. And then it seemed like perhaps if we just blend it all together, a whole bunch of nice fresh prepared bedding, which is not only shredded paper and cardboard, but it's also leaves mixed in and moisture, now combined with worm chow and coffee, that should be something that the worms are really going to enjoy. So now we can begin covering up the feeding area with some of this excavated material that was covering the feeding zone. And let's just give the outer edges of the bin a little bit of a till and inspection. A system that's still relatively young compared to some of my older systems that are in excess of 300 days old. A system like this that's only 86 days of age, less than 3 months of age, I would expect to have material that's not even capable of sort of clumping together or becoming really muddy. A system that's still this young, I assume, is still loaded with all kinds of bedding materials all over the place. So I don't worry so much about the material in systems like this getting really clumpy and nasty and muddy. But I still like the idea of just checking to see how things are doing out on the outskirts of the bins. Even though we're not feeding out there, We don't have a whole lot of business out here. If nothing else, I just like the idea of aerating it a little bit, even though it doesn't seem like it needs it terribly. And you can see there's a whole bunch of worms hanging out in that stuff. I usually assume the reason for that is because even though I'm not feeding there, a lot of the food items from previous feedings probably does get nudged out to those outer edges and is still available to them in great quantities, and has probably at that point had a good amount of time to break down to the point where worms can really make good use of it. So a lot of times I almost think to myself that the outskirts of the bins are possibly where the worms even prefer to be more than the feeding areas, where all the fresh food, fresh bedding's been applied. Perhaps all that stuff is just a little bit too new for them to really make a whole lot of use of quite yet. So I don't know, that's just sort of a theory. Alright, so following tradition, we're marking where we last fed using a coffee filter. Nice new replacement one here today. And back on goes this top covering, which is also kind of fun to have out here sometimes. A lot of times you come into your worm bin and worms are hanging out on top of this thing. Sort of like a little welcoming party. And now we can proceed with covering things up. Alright, if you ask me, things are looking really good here. And I would almost say that based on what we saw, I would have to guess that this is probably the system that might have the greater number of worms in it. I'm trying to remember the exact count. So we'll see. We'll get that other one out here now and we'll be able to tell, I think, right away based on how many worms we see in it. So let's get that one out here and get them fed. Here we go. They both have the same type of container. They have the same type of top covering plastic. But as we start to make our way down, we might start to see differences. And I think the first difference we're seeing that this is a much more weathered piece of newspaper. And even though it's holding up great, since I've got a replacement, I thought maybe this can go in as supplementary bedding down in the feeding zone. This stuff is nice and heavily inundated with all kinds of microbiology, all kinds of fungi and microbes and bacteria and everything else that the worms can really make good use of. Not to mention the fact that me just trying to lift it up results in it sort of tearing to shreds under its own weight. And as you can see, the feeding zone indicator is also in similar dire straits here. Not holding up too good. In fact, I think when we put it away last time, we noticed how it was really starting to deteriorate pretty heavily. So this being the slightly younger bin, we might see some slightly less broken down bedding materials in here. It feels to me like around the edges there's a little bit of dryness occurring where the plastic may not have been completely covering things up. But you saw how thorough we were. We'll just end up agitating everything. But you know what, let's switch the order. Why don't we do a quick examination of the outer edges of this system first, and then we'll proceed to the inner portion where the last feeding had been applied. Right away, my first impression is that there's not a whole lot of worm traffic out on this edge of the bin. Once again, possibly because it being a younger bin with fewer feedings over time, perhaps not so much interesting, yummy stuff has been nudged out to those far edges, perhaps making that material out on those edges not quite as interesting for the worms to remain in should they go out there exploring and not find a whole lot to eat. I mean, the bedding itself feels like something comfortable that they should probably be fine hanging out in. And we do see a couple worms in it, so there's nothing dangerous or off about it. But perhaps it's just the absence of a food supply out there. For that matter, I didn't really see any leftover bits of anything while in the other bin. When we excavated the outer edges, I do remember bumping into little bits of avocado and other things. Over on this side of the bin, I feel like maybe there's a little bit more casting material developing, as well as a couple worms hanging out here, maybe even a few more worms than what we saw on the opposite edge. But still, what I've seen so far tells me that I believe we are now working on the system that has the fewer number of worms living in it. Watch when we get to the feeding area, watch us get really surprised by the fact that maybe this is the system with the greater number of worms in it. No, I don't think so. I believe that we are probably dealing with the more sparsely populated bin here. So why don't we get to feeding these guys too? It does feel to me like perhaps in this system we could be a little bit more generous with bedding, although once again I can't seem to help thinking that we might want to just scale the application of materials into this bin to match the size of the population. Although some people might be saying, hey, you know what, you give them a lot of space to roam around in, they'll sense that, and then their first reaction is going to be to try to fill that available space with baby worms. So maybe it would be a good idea to see if I can work on trying to increase the overall volume of material that these little wormies have to live in over here. Maybe it'll actually spur on some breeding. They've done a pretty good job breaking this banana peel down, almost to the point where it feels like it's been stripped clean of all the actual fruit, leaving only the peel, very similar to what we saw on the peel in the other bin. Almost paper thin leftover material. And the arrangement was very similar, so after the banana peel comes the towel, and since there's a fewer number of worms living in here, I just have to assume that the progress that they're going to make on this piece of towel is going to be perhaps a little bit less than, you know, what we might observe happening in the other system. And then my guess is we're probably going to find a few similar kinds of leftover foods in here. Perhaps we'll find some avocado. Perhaps we'll see some skins off of some cantaloupe melon. We won't find a cork though, because the cork only lives in one of my systems. But here, for example, we've got a mango seed, once again still fresh enough that it's holding up and resisting my attempt to break it in half. Some leftover pieces of paper that were probably some of the bedding that we included last time. And what else? The seed out of an avocado. So you can already see some of the similarities between these two buddy bins. Or I think maybe, since these do have the same parent, I believe, just spawned off on different days because of different haul outs or something like that. I can't remember, but I'm fairly certain that these two systems were populated with worms from the same systems. I could be wrong though. I always try to kind of tailor the way I refer to the systems to match the way they were launched off in terms of their lineage, as to whether they're kind of sisters or brothers or even twins launched on the same day, versus perhaps systems that have the same worm breeds living in them, but worms that came from different parent bins, in which case they're simply buddy bins. Alright, so you know what? I like the idea of building the system out, so why don't we follow through on that idea to try to give them some nice fluffy material down at the bottom into which they can roam around and explore. We'll start with some of this prepared bedding. I was thinking about just dropping some of that top covering newspaper, but it just seemed like a wad of newspaper would just go down there and sit there. So I thought that that material we can possibly bring back into the fray as a somewhat higher level contribution. And this stuff will gradually have all the juices of everything above it dripping down into it, making it into a really tempting place to be. I guess putting some of the old leftover bits of food down into it will also possibly increase its appeal. So what else do we have here? We'll try to do the same thing in terms of trying to nest that that towel piece in between the old and the new feedings. So why don't we do that again as we did earlier. And as we did earlier, we bought in some of my fresh bedding to go right on top of the towel. onto which we place the coffee and the worm chow, and then I thought maybe this stuff, I don't know, maybe this stuff too can go in here. Since this outer edge of it is folded and is like double sturdy, it's already matted up just by its nature to the piece that it's folded over on with. We've already got some just sort of pre-matted paper here. Oh yeah, let's not forget we wanted to recycle this old piece of coffee filter too. So now we've actually created a whole bunch of stuff here, which is actually going to prevent the newly added coffee and worm chow from sprinkling down into the newly added shredded paper and cardboard mix. And you know, if I didn't miss stuff, it wouldn't be me, would it? I had hoped to add a little bit of grit, but you know what? We will add grit as soon as we place in the new foods, and we'll put it right into the new foods. I'm pretty sure we added grit last time, didn't we? I don't know. My mind is like a sieve. Oh, geez. Almost forgot about these other pieces of paper we wanted to do away with too. All in the same thinking that increase in the bedding supply is the main objective here by doing so. And it does seem to me like we've done a good job of that here. I think that by putting the coffee and whatnot on top of the old newspaper, on top of that shredded paper, and now putting all this on top of all of those things, we've once again kind of come up with a sort of stacked arrangement here. Hopefully one that the worms appreciate and compels them to wander around and explore all of it and take advantage of all of it. So now the only thing I think I did miss was the worm chow. Gosh, have I mentioned that I would probably forget my head if it wasn't screwed on tight? I think I did. So whatever, you know what? We're going to give them just a little bit more bedding so that I've got something interesting onto which we can sprinkle the worm chow. A lot of people might be thinking, oh my goodness, I thought this was the lesser populated system. It seems like we've given them so much food. I think the food is actually divvied out almost exactly evenly. The only thing that they got a whole lot of in here today was just a lot of supplementary bedding in order to just increase the overall volume of the quarters in which they're living. And I kind of like the idea of that because one of the side effects of that could actually be reproduction and an increased number of worms as a result. So that would be a good thing for this system. All right, well, it's not perfectly level, but it's close enough. Let's get things covered up here. And like I said earlier, I've got a replacement newspaper here. It's got a little bit of a oil stain on it because I used this as sort of the drop cloth yesterday when I was lubricating my two new shredders. Just running some cooking oil soaked paper through the machines, and that's just cooking oil, so I assume the worms will be fine with that. They'll probably nibble right through that. And onto this goes the covering, plastic covering, bringing us to the end of today's feeding. Very nice. All right, wormies, doing a good job in here. This is definitely the system with the fewer worms in it, I can tell right away. But now it's going to be harder to tell them apart from each other because there is now probably just as much material in here as there is in the other one. All right, everyone, I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that, though. Before I go really quick, though, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.